Welcome everyone to a special discussion, I guess, this time. So I've got with me Christoffer Doehlen, and we're going to have a discussion on antinatalism because it's a topic we, have differing opinions about. But before we get onto that, I just wanted to Christoffer will introduce himself, but I also just wanted to say how this came about. Now, some of you may have seen that Christoffer did a discussion about antinatalism with a colleague or a friend of his, and that was around a year ago, I think. And then I did a live stream reacting to that, which I sent to Christopher and his colleague slash friend. And then I reached out and said, and well, when I sent it to them, I also said, would you want to have a discussion? And Christopher kindly said yes. So here we are. So yeah, Christopher, do you want to just do a brief introduction about yourself, and then we can go straight into the main bit?
Great, yes, thank you. So, my name is Christoffer Doehlen. I am a Norwegian student. I study at the University of Oslo in Norway. And I also have my own YouTube channel called Christoffer Doehlen Official Channel. And I, generally speaking, enjoy philosophy and theology, to read about it, to discuss it, etc. I will also mention that I am a traditional Catholic and believe that it can be proven with certainty that God exists and that Catholicism is true. And I would recommend checking out the website vaticancatholic.com for more information and evidence for that. So, I believe that the philosophy of antinatalism is false and immoral. And so, about a year ago, I had on a Swiss YouTuber uh, on my channel, my YouTube channel, to discuss the subject of antinatalism. So what happened before that was that I was introduced to antinatalist thought and arguments at the university in a lecture, and sort of thought about discussing it with this Swiss YouTuber Almost Zweig on my channel. So we discussed back and forth our thoughts about antinatalism, about the value of life, and things related to that. Yeah, so that would be a brief introduction of myself.
Great. No, thanks for that. And if you want, near the end, send me a link to that website that you said about, and I can include that in the description, and I'll include a link to your channel, and you send me any other links you want people to see, and I can include them in there. So just before we go into the main section, I want to let everyone know that Christopher and I actually had this discussion already a few days ago, and we lost the recording, so we weren't able to use that. But so just to let people know, so that we might be referring to that conversation that we had, just so people aren't sort of in the dark about that. Okay, cool. So let's go straight into the meat of the subject, about antinatalism. So you were saying that you think it's false, and then you also said that you think it's immoral. And uh, just so I can quickly encapsulate it, um, and you correct me whenever I'm wrong, but when we had the discussion before, the main difference between us was that you essentially think procreation is a good, or at least a neutral thing, because you think that creating human life in and of itself is a good thing because you value human life. And I put more value on suffering and the sort of the experience that someone is going through. And I guess another difference between us is that I don't uh, I don't just look at the experience of humans, and we discuss animals as well. Um, so maybe we can go into that a bit, because I'm assuming that is where the sort of your belief about antinatalism being false comes from. But I also want to ask you in a bit about you also think it's immoral as well, which I think those are two slightly separate things, right? Um, so if we go into it being false, do you want to go into a bit about why you think, why you put value on human life itself, and not as much suffering?
Right, yes. So first, I can mention that there are at least two philosophical arguments against antinatalism, which I would use, but we can stick to the first one, which we also discussed last time, which I could present in this brief syllogism, and it would be the following. Premise one: it is morally good to give a human person human goods. Premise two: human life and existence are human goods. So then the conclusion, therefore, it is morally good to give a human person human life and existence, which is what procreation entails. So this is a strictly syllogistic argument, and both premises, if they are true, then the conclusion follows logically from the premises. Then we have an argument that refutes antinatalism, and I would maintain that both premises are true. And it seems to me that the dispute would be about whether human life and existence are human goods, and I would maintain that they are. And one of the ways I would argue for that is the fact that when we consider the morality of giving goods to human beings who already exist, such as giving food to the hungry, or water to the thirsty, or taking care of children, or something else, those things are morally good. And I would say that when we justify why it's morally good, we go back to the principle of, well, it's morally good because it's morally good to preserve their life. Their life is a good worth preserving. So that would sort of be a brief presentation of that argument against antinatalism.
Mm. And when we had the discussion before, I sort of asked the question about, because you were framing your argument in terms of human life itself, right? And as I just said before, I sort of more focus on not the fact that the life is human, just the fact that the life um, can experience. So I wouldn't give the same moral consideration to a bacteria, because the bacteria doesn't have any sort of subjective experience that we're aware of anyway. I don't know, maybe in like years down the line we'll find out that bacteria are sentient or whatever, but I doubt it. But either way, so I asked the question about um, if you put the value on creating human life rather than put the focus on the suffering that someone would go through. I asked the question of, well, if you were in sort of like a relationship and you were thinking about having a child with the other person, um, and you found out through some sort of genetic test that you were both carrying a gene that would cause the child to have some sort of condition that they would just have an awful life, suffer horribly by sort of any of our standards. Um, and and then I asked you, would you have an issue with someone creating that person? Did you want to go into your thoughts on that?
Sure. So, yes, I would say even in those cases where you have people who would be born with serious illnesses or bodily defects or genetic defects, which would perhaps involve a lot of suffering, even then, to bring that human being into existence is something that is good, because human life and existence as such are human goods, even though a particular human life can involve experience of suffering and defects. So, and I would say one way we could see this is that when it comes to living human persons who do have certain serious illnesses or genetic defects, I think we both would agree that it's morally good to take care of them or help them continue living on in this world. And we could ask the question, well, why is that a moral good? Why is it moral good to let those already existing human beings continue living? And ultimately, the only answer that makes sense is that their life is worth preserving. There's something about their life that makes it good to help them continue having it. And therefore, we see that, okay, so that human life is a good, even though it involves misery and suffering, it's still something good. And therefore, it is good to bring it into existence.
Yeah, so I think maybe a so I actually you were saying just then like people who already exist, we should take care of them, and I kind of nodded at that, and then you said that we should help continue their life, and then I was a bit more reserved because I think if someone who already exists has one of these conditions, where their life is like really quite bad. Um, I think we should help them to continue to exist if they want to. Um, but I think if that person, you know, sort of takes slot of their life and says, actually, I don't think this life is is really good for me. I'm not enjoying it, and I don't foresee myself enjoying it in the future. Um, I would prefer to sort of end it. And hopefully be helped in that so that I can go out in some sort of dignified way. Um, I I would then think that we should help facilitate that for them, and I think this sort of highlights maybe a difference of where we're coming at, um, because I think the fact that we want to help these people, I don't think it points to the goodness of human life itself. I think it points to um, the fact that we want to help serve the interests of sentient beings, basically. And I think that is so. For example, if someone had that condition and they wanted to continue living for whatever reason, then they would, that is their interest, that is their desire, and so I would help them facilitate that. But then also, if they flipped and said, actually, I don't want to continue existing anymore, I would then also follow their interest, what they see as best for them, and what is, also probably in my judgment as well, best for them. um Whereas I don't think you would make that flip, right? Because you value the human life itself, whereas I sort of put more emphasis on the interests of the person, rather than the fact that they have a human life themselves. I didn't know if you wanted to say anything about that before I go on.
Right. Yes. So I would say it's important to have a distinction here we are talking about the interest of a person. So on the one hand, we have the issue of simply desiring something or wishing something to be the case, having this conscious desire, and as we also discussed last time, that would not be a rational standard for whether something is morally good or bad, because desires can be good or bad depending on some other factor. Someone can desire to drink way too much alcohol and become drunk, but that's not good for him. So, desire itself, what simply a person wishes to do in a specific moment, will not be a good standard for determining the truth of these issues. So, another way we could look at it is, okay, when we talk about the interests of a person, what does that mean? What does it mean that something is in the interest of this person? And I would say the rational response is that it's in their interest if it promotes or preserve their being, or if you want, their well-being, that their being or their life it's about what contributes to their life and the health of their life. But to end their life is by definition the opposite of preserving their well-being and their life. So therefore that would, by that logic, not be in their interest. Even if they desire it consciously, even if they experience suffering, it would not actually be in their objective interest of their life to do so. Rather, what we have discovered is that it's their life, it's their existence, which is the good, the standard by which we determine whether something is within their interest or not.
Mm. Yeah, I agree with you is about not all desires should be satisfied, or that's not always a good justification. You can't just like rely on that. I think desires or interests have to be balanced, right? So I have an interest to eat, but if there's only a certain amount of food and someone else also has that interest, we should share the food rather than me just serving my own. So it's also about like balancing each other's interests, um, off against each other, I guess. And then you were saying about the interests, the reason that we like the reason that we care about the interests, or how to distinguish which interest is like valid in a way, is if it serves to sustain their being, right? But you also use the term well-being, and I'm not sure if you used being or well-being synonymously, but I see them as quite different, because I see being. So if I talk about myself, my being is just the fact that I exist, right? But my well-being is the experience happening within that existence, right? So it's like the being is almost like a container, and the well-being is what's within the container, right? And I think that the the way I view if we go back to the person who's got a condition and we're deciding whether it's more humane um, to sort of impose on them continued existence against their wish, or to sort of facilitate their wish and help them to die. The way that I see the interest there is that the interest should be serving the person's well-being rather than their being, because I think someone can get to a point, and if I talk about myself, like I could get, I'm like young, I'm relatively healthy at the moment, like compared to most people on the planet and in history, I have like a very good life, but it isn't necessarily always going to be that way. And I think uh, if my well-being becomes sufficiently bad, if I'm insufficient, if I'm suffering sufficiently enough, I think that sustaining my being can actually be counter to my well-being. And I think that would also be the case with someone who has maybe like that genetic condition, right? We could force them to continue existing, but that is going to be, it's going to sustain their being, but that being for them better than the alternative of ending it, where they wouldn't be them anymore, they would just not exist. um yeah, I get. Maybe that's just like a fundamental difference of where we sort of place our value. I place it more in the experience, and you place it more in the actual sort of life itself. I'm not sure if there's any way to sort of reconcile that, or that's just um, axiomatic in some way. Um, I don't know if you have anything to say about that before I go on.
Well, I can briefly state some things that I could use as analogies to the idea which I would present forward, that well being is about promoting their objective being or existence. For instance, when we have some illness or disease in our body, we go to the doctor, and what is the doctor supposed to do? He is supposed to cure the body if possible. That means restoring the body to a healthy state. So it's not strictly speaking about the experience of the person, but rather his objective being or the condition of his being, and hence it's to speak more philosophically, it's about the ontology of the being. That is the being itself, the existence of that person itself, which is the standard. And to have experience be some sort of standard, whether something is in someone's well-being or not, um, would not be a reasonable standard, because first of all, experience can be good or bad depending on some external or third factor. It's not like pleasure is good in itself or pain is necessarily bad in itself. It's rather a reaction on something else, and that's also another philosophical issue. So rather, well-being must be grounded in being. That makes sense also in the very term well-being. But if you end that being, well, that by definition contradicts well being. So, yeah, perhaps more could be said, but that's at least some brief comments I would have about that.
Mm. Um, yeah, I'll quickly say something in response, and then I want to bring it back on to antinatalism more specifically. The thing that you were saying about the doctor, I get what you mean, but I think doctors serve both. I think that doctors, one, serve to sustain someone's being, because I think the reason that I think they do that. So obviously, they cure certain diseases so that people will continue living. But I don't think that is a point against talking about like people's interests rather than being itself, because once someone is created, like the vast majority of people have an interest in continuing to live. It's just sort of like a deep biological thing, right? So that I think doctors trying to help people to continue living does serve a sort of base interest rather than just go to sustain being in an abstract way. But also, I think doctors do go to serve interests rather than just like go to serve well-being rather than just being, because there are many cases or examples where someone would go to the doctor to cure something they have that actually wouldn't kill them. There can be many things that someone would have that would lower their quality of life or their well-being, but not necessarily kill them, right? So you could maybe give an example of some sort of like sexually transmitted disease that is not nice but relatively mild on the scale of things. This could be some sort of disease that is not going to kill you. You could live your life. You could live your whole life having this disease, but it wouldn't be nice. You would suffer from the symptoms. You would have sort of like a lower quality of life. Um, do you get what I mean there?
Perhaps I would say that there can be diseases that doesn't kill one; it's not deadly, but it still is bad because it deviates from being. For instance, some organ functioning less than optimally. Well, it might not necessarily kill that person, but it's still the problem here is the fact that his being or his life is reduced in some way.
Mm,
So still here the grounding is life itself.
mm. Okay, cool. So to take it back, sort of directly onto antinatalism that we were talking about before. Should we go back to the sort of second thing that you were saying? Because you said that you think antinatalism is false, and I think we've sort of gone over why. Maybe that's where our difference comes from. I sort of value experience, and you value being, or not that you don't value experience, but obviously you just value being more, perhaps. But then after that, you also said that you think it's immoral as well. Do you want to go into why you think that antinatalism is immoral? And also, I'll just quickly ask a question that you can maybe answer while you're doing that. Do you think antinatalism is immoral? Or do you think that not procreating is immoral, even if someone does that for any reason, not just antinatalist?
Okay, so perhaps I can first address the very last question you asked briefly, and then go on to the bigger question. Right. So, yes, the idea of antinatalism, that is the idea that people should not procreate as a principle, that is immoral. Now, if some particular person, for some particular reason, chooses not to procreate, that could be a good thing. Like in the religion that I belong to, Catholicism, you have the principle of celibacy, that if you become a priest, you should live in celibacy. So I believe that it's not necessarily wrong not to have children. But I do believe that if you desire to get married and have a spouse, then you have committed yourself to the obligation of having a family, because that's the primary purpose of marriage. So yes, there would be a distinction there between, okay, when is it okay not to procreate? Yes, it can be, but the idea that it's wrong in principle to procreate, that is the problem, the immoral issue. Okay, so
Okay, that
yeah,
sorry, yeah, no, no, you go, you go.
right. So that would be my response there. Right. So I would say antinatalism is immoral. Multiple reasons I could give, but one of them goes also to this argument that I have presented. The idea that it's morally good to give a human person human goods. Human life and existence are human goods. Therefore, it's morally good to give people that. Now, if this argument succeeds and is correct, which I maintain and argue for, then it follows that whatever denies people the moral right to give others moral goods is itself immoral. So, in other words, any idea or position or philosophy which says that you should not do this thing, and that thing which they say is morally prohibited is in itself good, morally good, then by definition it becomes morally bad to oppose it. Um, Such as if if you help your children grow up and you give them food when they're infants and so on, and there is some philosophy, for the sake of the argument, some philosophy which says you should not feed your children at all, you should just neglect them, that philosophy would be immoral. And the reason why is because it denies the principle which itself is morally good, namely feeding children. And I would sort of apply the same idea to why antinatalism is wrong. So it's sort of a logical consequence of this argument against antinatalism, which is why it would be immoral.
Okay, yeah, I think I understand. So I would agree in the case of like if there is some sort of idea that that could, like, if I take the example that you were talking about, how if there was some sort of uh group out there that was trying to convince people not to feed their children and just let their children become malnourished and then maybe die of starvation or something like that. um then I would be 100% on the same page as you. That is, that's a toxic and bad and immoral thing to try and convince people of, and even more if the parents then do it and follow through with it. Um, but the reason I think that is because there's a victim to um, that action or idea, right? Namely the children. There's a tangible victim that you can even look at. It's not like um, they are someone far away or something like that. It's there's a tangible victim to that action or spreading of that idea. But with antinatalism, I don't know if I can say the same, because before someone exists, by definition, they don't exist, and so how can they be a victim to you know someone not procreating? So, for example, um, if I take me as an example again, right? Now, I exist, obviously. I have one sister, um, and my parents, right? So they had two kids. Do you think that let's say that let's say my parents, after having me and my sister, became antinatalist, which they're not, but for the sake of argument. And then they decided, actually, we were planning on having a third child, but we're not going to have that third child anymore because, we've been convinced of antinatalism. Do you think that they are doing a bad thing there and they're harming the third child that doesn't exist? It because that third child only exists as an abstract thing in their mind, just like a figment of their imagination.
Right. So, if you have parents who would choose not to have more children, in certain circumstances, that can be morally permissible. So, yes, it's not necessarily morally wrong to do that. Right. So, when you present this point about simply choosing to not bring more human beings into existence, that doesn't mean that there is a victim, because it's simply someone not existing. So there is not a victim actually there. But I would say that when we examine philosophically I would say the immorality of the antinatalist philosophy, strictly speaking, it would be a philosophical attack on something positive, rather than, strictly speaking, the promotion of something purely negative. That is the problem. So antinatalism would say that parents who do decide to bring children into existence into this world, that they have done something morally wrong, as I understand antinatalism. So that would be the reason, or one of the reasons I would say, for why it would be moral, that it says something is wrong which is good. So I agree that someone who chooses not to have children, that is not necessarily a bad thing. So that would not be the focus of why I would argue antinatalism is wrong. So we could agree there. However, when it is said that something which is positive is actually something bad, therein lies the problem, if you see what I mean.
Okay. So if just so I can understand, like obviously this is never going to happen, but let's say that sort of people all around the world just sort of, oh, you know how birth rates are declining, at least in the West, right? In Western countries.
I've heard about that.
Um, yeah, yeah. So let's say that trend kind of continues, and that's not obviously because of antinatalism. That's just because of people's, they're more committed to their careers or whatever. Maybe people just want for whatever reason to have less kids. If that trend continues, would you say that that is something that we should try and counter? As in, we should actively fight against it so people bring more people into existence, or do you think? Oh well, it's got nothing to do with antinatalism. There's no bad idea behind it, so that the sort of practical thing that's happening is fine, even though the practical thing that's happening is exactly the same as if it was being fueled by antinatalism. Do you understand what I mean?
Perhaps I can at least try to
Yeah.
share some thoughts and then you can respond to that. So I would say that there are immoral issues with why we see declining birth rates. Not perhaps strictly speaking with the explicit antinatalist claim, but certain other reasons. For instance, and this would perhaps be a little bit off topic, but I firmly believe that the use of contraception and abortion are morally wrong. So, to the extent that those two things contribute to less children being born into the world, that is wrong. Or also another thing called quote naturally family planning, which is the idea that a married couple they have sexual intercourse, but they actively do it so to prevent children. That also would be immoral because it contradicts the primary purpose of the conjugal act, which is procreation. So perhaps that would not be strictly speaking the antinatalist issue, but it would be immoral uh, because of these reasons I just mentioned. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's interesting. So, leaving abortion aside, because I think that's a very complicated topic that would we could get so sidetracked. I wanted to focus on contraception because I find it quite interesting. Um, so, from my understanding, from what you've just said, you're opposed to contraception because what it does is it prevents the sort of the natural course of things happening when two people have sex, and it turns the it changes the intention behind sex from procreating to either just having pleasure or bonding with the partner or something like that. Is that the reason that you were saying? Am I getting it right? Why you're sort of opposed to that? Is it because it sort of changes the nature of the act away from its sort of natural purpose?
Yes, it actively frustrates or prevents the primary purpose from being realized.
Okay, cool. So, so, s- so if let's say you have like a couple who are sort of they just don't so would you say a couple not having sex is better than a couple having sex but using a condom?
Well, you could say it's better for them simply to abstain from sexual intercourse, than having it but abusing it. Because abstinence can be morally
Mm.
permissible, even in marriage in certain cases, but the use of contraception is itself an abuse of the sexual act.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I don't want to get sidetracked on that as well because it will take us away from the main topic, antinatalism. You were saying that there are sort of like multiple reasons. Did you want to go into any of the other ones? So that just to round off the first one, it's because you see. creating new humans as a good thing, and antinatalism seeks to dissuade people from doing that good thing, right?
Right, it denies the very principle of
Yeah,
creating children, which is a good thing in itself.
cool. Yeah, do you want to go into your other ones as well?
Sure. Right. So I can just briefly state that. So there's one other reason which I can get into. There are also religious reasons, but we don't necessarily have to get into that.
Mm,
A second reason would be appealing to what is called the natural law, and briefly that would be the idea that in a way, what is morally good or virtuous for human people to do is to act in conformity with their human nature. Human nature is that which makes us human, which all human beings, by definition, share with one another. And that would be the basis, for instance, why something is virtuous, because it is acting in accordance with our nature. The reason why a prudence is a moral virtue is because we are using our natural faculty of reason in accordance with its natural purpose, which is using it rationally by definition. So, um, and for instance, the reason why it's good to eat food to nourish ourselves is because we are acting in conformity with our nature, which demands nourishment on a continual basis. Now, another aspect of our human nature is our sexuality. We have certain sexual faculties by nature, which involve the use of certain sexual organs and a sexual act, which when used according to the nature, results in procreation. Not necessarily, there might be some infertility involved, but that's what it's naturally designed to do. So, since therefore it is morally good to act according to our nature, and the inherent natural purpose of our sexual faculties is procreation, therefore, it follows that it cannot be wrong to do that which is in itself in accordance with human nature. Doing something according to our nature cannot be, in principle, wrong. So that is sort of the
mm.
argument from the natural law.
And why do you think that we should care what is natural?
Right. So first, I think it is very useful here to clarify what is meant by natural. It's not simply whatever happens in nature, right? Because you can have animals which kill other animals and things like that, but that doesn't mean that we should kill other people. So it's important in this context, to clarify that human nature is about using things or faculties which we have by nature. Just as we have intelligence, using that rationally is a rational way to do it. We have eyes, and their natural purpose is sight. We have ears, their purpose is hearing. The nature of our heart is to pump blood, and so on and so forth. So it's an examination of what are we as human beings, and what is we inherently, literally meant to do. What is the inherent design of our nature? So it doesn't mean so that sorry. In other words, that would mean that we should use our being, to put it that way, in accordance with its nature. So it's not simply whatever happens in the ecological system or in nature is the same as natural in this sense, but rather using our faculties is in accordance with their essence, to put it another way.
Okay, yeah. So, why, if if following that line of logic was going to cause others harm, um, why do you think we should maintain that sort of principle? So, like, I'll give you an example. So, you were talking about, we have eyes, and the natural use is to see and whatever. So, presumably, the reproductive organs we have, their natural use is to reproduce. And the way that I would see it is that using the sort of the like the natural use of those things would cause others harm. And so I would say, well, therefore, we shouldn't just appeal to the fact that we have this organ that has a natural use, we should actually, essentially think, is this going to harm someone or not? The same that we would do with, we have vocal cords to speak, but it doesn't mean that, all speech is good, right? I could say certain things, that would offend you, or you would say certain things that would offend me, or I could call someone a horrible name. It doesn't mean that it just gives me total freedom to it doesn't mean that it's always what I should do. Do you get what I mean?
Yes.
So,
Yeah, and
yeah.
I would also comment briefly on the issue of speech. One application of this principle is that, okay, so speech is natural for humans. However, speech or the ability to communicate can also be abused. And the way that it can be abused is lying. So, why is lying wrong? According to this philosophical principle, one of the reasons it is wrong is that you are using the faculty of communication against its purpose, because its purpose is, at least among one purpose, is to communicate information to others. And if you communicate lies, then you literally use it against its purpose. So that's perhaps a somewhat philosophically analogous to why the abuse of sexual faculties is immoral, because it's using them against their purpose.
Mm. But so why do you think that we should? Why do you think that the natural purpose of something gives a justification for its use?
Right, so this gets sort of into deep philosophy, but to explain briefly, it is because this is what it means to be a good human being, literally. So when we think about, well, what is a good human being? Well, the standard is that something is good to the extent it conforms to its nature. So I can give some examples. And these are just very trivial examples. Like the difference between a good tree and a bad tree is that a good tree conforms to its essence more. For instance, an apple tree, a good apple tree is one who is better able to produce apples, have stronger roots, etc. But a bad apple tree is one who lacks these abilities, at least to a certain degree. A good triangle that is drawn is one who is drawn more in conformity with the geometrical shape, and a bad triangle drawn is one which is drawn worse. So these are
Mm.
just trivial examples. They're not, of course, morally relevant issues, but it just illustrates
Mm.
the point that something is good or bad depending on whether they conform to nature. And as Aristotle,
Can I quickly?
yeah,
Sorry, I just wanted to quickly ask a question. Because you were saying, like with the example of like a good or bad apple tree, um, but the thing I would ask is like, who is judging the goodness or badness? Because, and I'll give you the reason it popped into my head is because I'm not sure if this is the same in Norway, but in the UK, sometimes people will manipulate trees so that they form certain shapes, whether that be for art or to make furniture. Um, and presumably, by what you were saying, that would obviously make it a bad apple tree because it wouldn't really make many apples. It would just serve the purpose of having a chair. But I don't think that would necessarily make it like a bad apple tree just because it's not doing what it naturally would otherwise without interference. Because um, one, the apple tree is not harmed by that, but also the person manipulating it for furniture um, would say, well, no, this is a good apple tree because it's serving the purpose that I have given it. If you get what I mean.
yeah, I understand. So I would say that, okay, when someone in that context would say that, well, in this case, it's a good apple tree, well, they're sort of using the term in a very vague sense, because they're really meaning is that, yes, intrinsically, the apple tree is bad, but nevertheless, that has a good effect for us human beings. But when I talk about something being good in this philosophical sense, it is about the thing itself, its very essence or its very nature. Just as, let's say, all human beings suddenly disappeared from the earth, it will still be the case that the difference between a good knife and a bad knife is how well the knife cuts, because it always refers back to what is a knife, what it is very function or nature. So the reference point is always the essence of the thing.
Mm.
independently of whether some human beings have certain wishes that they want to do with it.
Can I? This was a question that popped into my head about the essence of being in our last conversation, and I don't think I asked it, but maybe I did. So maybe I'm repeating myself. But when you were talking about like the essence of being, and in the other conversation we had, you talked about how humans have a certain essence, right? And I um, because we were talking about moral agents, and I brought up how some humans aren't moral agents, and you said that well, those humans still have the essence of being human, which is why we afford them moral consideration, even if they're not moral agents. And it brought a thought to my mind of, well, let's say in some alternative universe, um, like 90% of humans um, are not moral agents. They have these sort of, our genetics are in such a way that 90% of offspring will have these, what we see as defects, but would be completely normal there and they wouldn't be moral agents, and only 10% would be. So to me, in that case, it seems um, like the human essence would be not to be moral agents, but I still think all of those people, regardless of the fact that only 10% are moral agents, I think all of them um, should have moral value. Would you agree, or would you see it differently? Would you then say that that group of that sort of um, the essence of humanity there would discard all of them from being having moral value?
Very interesting point you bring up there. So I would say that that hypothetical scenario has in itself philosophical problems that makes it very difficult to respond to it in the way you were talking about, because there
Mm,
is actually this philosophical principle called nature does nothing in vain. So that would have to be explained today because it can be easily misunderstood. But it means that whatever flows naturally from the essence of a thing, that thing will usually produce. And it's true that in some cases there are defects, there are some problems that get in the way, but those would be expected to be those would be exceptions to the rule rather than the rule itself. So, sort of, one way in which we can discover whether something is natural or not is, in one way, induction. That something is in the vast majority of cases produced, then it makes sense that okay, it flows from the nature, it's not accidental. So hence, when we see that the vast majority of human beings they attain the age of reason, they can be moral agents, then we can rationally infer from that then that flows from our essence, which also infants share, even though they don't have the faculties developed yet.
mm. Okay, so what if I remove the label of human, and let's say this is another species um of let's say there's a sort of some sort of ape, so we're homo sapiens, but there are also gorillas or bonobos or whatever. But let's say there's another species that is, they're not human, but they're practically exactly the same as humans, but they have this thing of 90% of them aren't moral agents and only 10% of them are. Would you then say that they don't have any moral consideration at all?
Well, first I would say that that hypothetical scenario in itself would be very strange. But even if we take that into account, I would say that okay, well, some of them have moral agency. Why is that? It must come from their nature because all things act, all things their features or faculties are always related to their essence. So that would mean that it has to come from their nature. Even though it would be very strange for the majority of them not to have that agency, those who do would still, their agency would have to be accounted for. So it
Hmm.
would mean that okay, it is grounded in their nature.
But aren't you kind of then picking and choosing what you want who you want to value? Because, you can, is it in that example, you say, oh, well, some of them have moral agency and therefore that is part of their nature. But then when we look at humans as they are today, it's a minority of humans who aren't moral agents, right? And you say, oh well, that's fine because that's not part of our nature, because the majority are moral agents. But then you flip it in this other example and say, well, actually, I'm allowing the minority to take precedent because they, that's part of their nature. Whereas in humans today, you deny the minority being part of our nature. Do you understand the sort of the issue?
Perhaps, well, it sort of gets into deep metaphysics here, but
Mm,
to briefly explain, even though, of course, this can be discussed more deeply, but I would briefly say that we have to distinguish between some real feature that that a person possesses, and a defect. Because a defect, if we think about, well, what is a defect? A defect is some uh, absence or privation of a feature. So whenever we see a sick body or a body with a defect, that means that, okay, there is some problem here which prevents its natural features from being realized. So defects are, strictly speaking, not things in themselves. It's sort of related to how evil, according to classical scholastic philosophy, is, strictly speaking, a privation of good rather than a substance, a real being, existing thing in itself. So, therefore, strictly speaking, defects would not be something that comes from nature, because it's simply the absence of the nature being fulfilled. And absence of something is not the same as something that exists as its own thing. So, again, this is deep metaphysics, but that's a brief response, I would say.
mm. Yeah, no, okay, cool. We're coming up to an hour, so I thought maybe we'd sort of close off soon. I just wanted to clarify that the reason I wanted to go into that discussion about the essence of humans is because um, I thought it would be interesting to explore why, um, like, why that essence is important. Because the way I see it is that um, I I just value um, anyone who can, experience subjectively is sentient, whether they're human or not. I think that is the essence of ethics, basically. For me, I think that is the sort of currency by which ethics is cashed out. Um, and that's why I value all humans, whether they're moral agents or not. But I also value other individuals in other species, because I value the experience they have rather than whether they're moral agents or not. And so I think if there's a human that's a moral agent, if there's a human that isn't a moral agent, I think it's irrelevant that the rest of humans are moral agents. I think that person, regardless of the nature of the rest of their species, I think that individual matters, which is also why I think like a pig matters, or etc. etc, regardless of whether all other pigs are moral agents or not. So that's why I wanted to sort of go into that part. But what I'll do is I'll quickly like round off, and then I'll hand to you, and you can round off anything or add any final touches you want to, and then we can close. So just to round off on my sort of end. Um, uh, I think basically it seems like the key difference between us is what I was saying before, is you sort of value human life in and of itself, and therefore you're against antinatalism, because antinatalism is against creating what you see as like a good, um, whereas I put the value on um, the interest and experience of sentient beings, right? And so I think whilst when someone does exist, obviously we should care for them and help them try and achieve their interests if they don't infringe on the interests of others. Um, but I don't see any use in creating interest out of nothing. And I think when we do, uh, I one think I don't see why we would do that, but when we do, it also brings with it the potential for great harm, and obviously the guarantee of death as well. Um, so I think that is how I would round off. Do you want to do any sort of closing remarks you want to do, or just add any final touches?
Yes, I could do so. Right. So, I would first say that, as I have also explained in this video, I firmly believe that human life is a good in and of itself. And I would say that when we consider why is it moral to give goods to already existing human beings, give food to the hungry, water to the thirsty, the ultimate reference point is that human life itself is worth preserving. And I would say that the problem with subjective experience or sentience being the grounding is that, well, why is it good to experience, say, pleasure or joy or things like that? We would have to analyze it further and find out, okay, it's good to the extent it serves the being or the existence of someone. Otherwise, we could just say, well, why is this desire worth fulfilling? Or why is this need worth satisfying? There must be some ultimate reference point that is human life and existence in itself. And therefore, we cannot escape the conclusion that it's good to procreate in itself because we give someone human life. Even though it's true, it can involve a lot of suffering, still the life itself is valuable. It's not made worthless or not worth bringing into existence simply because of those things. So I would say that there are much more that could be said. We could go more into the difference between animals and human beings and veganism, though that would be sort of another topic. And so much more could be said, but I think we covered some very interesting and important grounds in this discussion. Um, and Yeah, since this would sort of be the end of it, I would say thank you for having me on. It was interesting and of value, I would say this discussion was. So yeah, I'm not sure if I have anything more significant to add than that.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you for coming on a second time. Uh, and yeah, like, thank you for sharing your thoughts and like exploring that with me. Yeah, it's been good to have you on. Just before we finish, do you want to say, if anyone wants to follow any work you do you have a website you would point them towards, or your YouTube channel, or anything like that?
Right, so I would say two YouTube channels. The one which I mentioned earlier, Christoffer Doehlen official channel. Perhaps you could have a link in the description. And there is also another one, an English speaking channel, because the first one is mostly Norwegian, but sometimes English too. So the second one would be called Catholic Tradition, but it hasn't any content yet. It's empty for now. But I mean, if people want to check it out, they can do so. Yes, and also the website I mentioned earlier, VaticanCatholic.com. It has nothing to do with me, that website, but it contains a lot of interesting information about Catholicism, arguments for God's existence, intelligent design, all that. Yeah,
Okay, great. Yeah, if you send me the links, I'll put them all in the description. But for now, thank you for coming on. And yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
thank you.